Hello, Socratic Vet here. Today I'm going to ask questions I hoped I would never have to address again. But in light of what is in the news, here we go. Is violence moral? Not when is it legal, not when is it understandable, not when is it politically convenient. When I say moral, I mean when is it right, just. A lot of people are talking about violence like we all agree on what it is and when it's justified. But do we? Sure seems like we don't. So let's ask some questions and talk it through together. I'm going to be slow and deliberate and define clearly. I apologize up front. There's going to be a fair amount of repetition in this video. The language used in a lot of these definitions is circular and repetitive. And I believe that there is some intention behind this. I think it was a rhetorical strategy. But that's my opinion. Please decide for yourselves. So what is violence? Well, historically, violence meant physical force, a punch, a weapon, a blow, something that leaves a mark on the body or destroys property. But in the modern discourse, some believe violence can also mean emotional harm, psychological distress, or even speech that makes someone feel unsafe, non-existent, unseen, marginalized. So which definition are you using? Is violence physical harm? Historically, yes. Violence was the deliberate use of physical force against a person. Today, violence can include emotional injury, trauma, or the feeling of being erased. So is violence something that happens to you or something you feel? Is violence defined by its intent? Traditionally, intent mattered. Violence was purposeful force. You meant to cause injury or coerce. Today's framework, intent is often considered irrelevant or explained through inherent bias or systemic historical structures. If someone feels harmed, the act can be labeled violent, even if the person causing it meant no harm. So is violence about what you meant or about how someone else interprets it? Is violence defined by its effect? In the past, the effect had to be physical, bruises, broken bones, broken windows. Today, the effect can be psychological, fear, marginalization, exclusion. So is violence something measurable or something subjective? Does property destruction count as violence? In the historical context, absolutely. Destroying property was considered violent coercion, a way to force compliance. Modern rhetoric, property destruction is framed as nonviolent, mostly peaceful, as long as no person is physically harmed. How often have you heard in the news that people say, well, that's what insurance is for, or they have the money, so it's no big deal? So is violence about the effect on the target, or is it about the method? Can speech be violent? Historically, in the West, speech is not considered violence. It could incite violence, but it wasn't violent in and of itself. Modern discourse, speech can and often is labeled violent because it causes emotional harm, reinforces oppression, challenges identity. So is violence something you do with your physical body, or is it something you do with your words? And if we can't define violence, how can we find its uses or moral justifications? Historically, the definition was narrow, so the justifications had to be narrow. Today, the definition is broad, and so are the justifications. Now, before we can answer whether violence is moral, we have to ask some more basic questions, like what is violence for? What purpose does it serve? What function does it perform? What effect does it have? Because the answer to those questions determines everything that comes after. Historically, violence has had specific and limited functions. In the classical political theory, violence's job was not mysterious. It was to impose will. Force was the final arbiter when persuasion and negotiation had failed. It was to protect life. Violence was justified only when it prevented greater physical harm. It was used to maintain order, institutions, use force to keep chaos at bay. It's used to deter threats, the threat of force preventing greater violence. Violence was a tool with boundaries. It was considered dangerous, and so it was constrained. Modern activist frameworks, violence can serve many different functions. It's almost like it has a dial versus the old philosophy of it was a switch. Once you turn it on, it's on. Now that feels like they can ramp it up and ramp it down. And it goes beyond physical force. It's to resist oppression. Violence becomes a response to systemic injustice. It's to reclaim power. It's framed as empowerment or liberation. It's to disrupt systems. It's used to challenge structures, not individuals. So it's okay. It's to express identity based on harm. Violence becomes symbolic, expressive, cathartic. These are not the same functions as historical ones. There is some overlap, but it's new vocabulary, right? It's new moral vocabulary, and therefore it's different moral logic. So what is violence for? Is violence a protective tool, an expressive act, a political instrument, a symbolic gesture, a system-breaking force? Because the answer leads to a different moral framework. If violence is for protection, then its use is narrow. If violence is for expression or identity, then its use expands dramatically. If it's for political transformation, then it becomes exclusively utilitarian and can almost just be justified by anything. And that's why these questions matter. So let's talk about what violence actually does, not what people claim. But historically, violence has had very specific functions and effects. And today, the word is used to describe a much wider range of effects: physical, emotional, systemic, symbolic. And understanding the shift is crucial. So, one of the first things violence does is violence escalates conflict. And that means it's a cycle of retaliation. One act of force triggers another. It destabilizes order and invites counter-violence. Now, escalation also means emotional harm. Increasing fear or the creation of an unsafe environment is considered escalation. Escalation has become psychological, not just physical. So what do we mean when we say violence escalates? Escalates what today? Number two, violence spreads beyond its target. Historically, violence spreads through communities: panic, instability, breakdown of trust, collapse of institutions. The modern landscape, it seems to spread through trauma, a social contagion, and harmful narratives. A single act can ripple through identity groups, marginalized communities. So is violence spreading because of the physical consequences or because of emotional harm or perceived emotional harm? Number three, violence creates collateral damage. Historically, even justified violence, like self-defense, has additional physical harms. It can destabilize families, communities, or political systems. In today's conflicts, even protective actions can be framed as reinforcing systems, oppression, or systemic harm. For example, a police intervention might prevent immediate physical harm, but is interpreted as perpetuating structural violence and therefore is not moral. So what counts as a new harm? Physical, emotional, structural? So if violence is inherently harmful, can it ever be moral? Historically, morality was tied to preventing greater physical harm, protecting innocence, and preserving social order. Violence was justified only when it protected life or restored stability. In the current climate, the morality seems tied to reducing oppression, trauma, or inequity. Violence might be condemned even if it prevents physical harm because it perpetuates a perceived injustice. So which moral framework are you using? And now we're at the heart of the issue, the moral paradox. We've established that violence is harmful. That's not controversial. But refusing violence can also be harmful. And that's where the tension lives. So let's walk through it. Number one, if violence is harmful, using it is wrong. Yes, this is straightforward. Violence is morally wrong because it causes physical injury, destroys stability, and threatens life. So the moral rule is simple: do not cause harm unless you must. But today, physical force, dismantling oppression, trauma, or inequity, fits into the very definition. Harm is not just physical. It can be emotional, symbolic, or structural. So what makes violence wrong? The physical injury or the social meaning? Number two, If refusing violence allows greater harm, not using it is wrong. Historically, failing to stop physical harm was considered a moral failure. If someone is about to kill an innocent person and you do nothing, you are morally responsible for the outcome. The old saying, evil persists when good men do nothing. But modern uses, such greater harm can also mean systemic injustice, marginalization, perpetuating oppressive frameworks. In that framework, refusing to confront injustice, even forcefully, can be seen and often is construed as complicity. The silence is violent chant comes to mind. So what counts as greater harm, a broken body or a broken system? Number 3, which harm is worse? This is the pivot. Historically, the hierarchy has been clear. Loss of life is the greatest harm. Everything else is secondary. In today's conflict, you hear harm can be physical, emotional, or structural. And these can be treated as morally equivalent or even interchangeable. So which harm carries the highest moral weight? The harm that ends a life or the harm that shapes a life? So now I ask, what moral responsibility do we have to prevent harm, if any? Historically, the responsibility was to protect life and maintain social order. Violence was justified only when it preserved life or restored stability. Today, we can be told responsibility to protect marginalized groups, reduce systemic injustice, prevent emotional or symbolic harm. Stability has been removed entirely from the conversation, and physical harm is dependent on the oppressed versus oppressor dichotomy. So which moral responsibility defies your framework? Protecting life or protecting identities and philosophies? So, what is the greatest harm? Is there a hierarchy? Because until we answer that, we can't answer whether violence is moral or justified. So let's walk through the possibilities. 1, is the greatest harm property damage? Historically, property damage, destruction was absolutely considered violence, but it was always ranked below bodily harm. You can rebuild a building, you can replace a window, you cannot replace a life. Today, I hear one side argue property destruction is non-violent, mostly peaceful. If no person is physically harmed, the harm is symbolic, not bodily. So is property damage a moral harm or a political message? What if the damage is to food supply, water supply, critical infrastructure? Is it harm then? Number 2, is the greatest harm offense or humiliation? Historically, in the U.S., emotional injury is considered harmful, but it is not violence, and it did not justify force. Now, emotional harm, humiliation, misgendering, exclusion can often be labeled as violence. The harm is internal, subjective, and tied to identity. So is the greatest harm something that happens to the body or something that happens to the feelings? Number 3, is the greatest harm political loss? Historically, political defeat is not a moral harm or physical harm. It was part of democratic life. You lose, you regroup, you try again. In today's climate, political outcomes are framed as existential threats to identity groups. A policy change can be described as violence against marginalized communities. So is political loss a setback or a form of violence? Or, number 4, is the greatest harm the destruction of life? Historically, this was at the top of the hierarchy. The one harm that cannot be undone. The harm that overrides all others. In modern frameworks, the loss of life is one harm among many forms of violence, physical, emotional, structural, symbolic, but can and will be subjugated in importance if you do not fall within an ideology or political affiliation. So which framework are you using? The one that treats life as the highest value, or the one that treats multiple harms as morally equivalent? Because if life is not the highest value, then violence can be justified for almost anything. But if life is the highest value, then violence can only be justified to protect it. Now that we've mapped out our hierarchy of harms, we can finally ask the real question: what threshold justifies violence? Because if violence is always harmful, then crossing that line requires a reason powerful enough to outweigh the harm you're about to cause. So let's walk through the possibilities. Number 1, if violence is always harmful, what threshold must be crossed? Historically, the threshold was extremely narrow. Imminent physical danger or threat to life. Violence was a last resort, justified only by preventing greater harm. Now, with modern definitions, the threshold can be much broader: emotional harm, symbolic harm, systemic oppression, or the threats to identity. So what level of harm is enough to justify physical force? Is the threshold personal offense? Historically, offense never justified open violence. You could be insulted, mocked, humiliated, and still have no moral right to strike back, especially once dueling was outlawed. In modern frameworks, offense can be framed as violence. If words are violence, then responding with force becomes easier to justify. So is offense a harm that justifies force, or is it feelings that just must be endured? Is the threshold political disagreement? Historically, the U.S. political conflict was handled through institutions, debate, elections, courts. Violence was seen as a breakdown, capitulation. I've lost the argument, let's get violent. Lately, political outcomes are framed as existential threats to identity groups and the core foundations of our society. If a policy is violence, then resisting it forcefully can be framed as self-defense. So is political loss a setback or a justification for force? Is the threshold physical danger? Historically, for many, this was the only legitimate threshold. If someone is about to cause physical harm or they perceive imminent physical harm, you may use force to stop them. Current discourse debates physical danger is one harm among many, not necessarily the highest, depending on the person. A racial slur is grounds for physical retaliation. If you are a minority or protected class, if you are in the majority, you better be an ally on the front line of fighting for the marginalized to have any hope of any violence you commit being justified. So is physical danger the moral line? Or just one line among several? 5. If the threshold is danger, what kind of danger matters most? Historically, the answer is clear. Danger to life is the highest threshold. In modern conflict, danger shows preference towards threats to identity, dignity, or systemic positions. Harms that are real, but are they equivalent to the loss of life? So which danger carries the highest moral weight? The danger that ends life, or the danger that affects how life is lived? Because your answer to that question determines whether violence is justified or ever will be. Now I reached the moment where the questioning we've done starts to converge. This is where the implications of your own answers become impossible to ignore, and we can build our moral framework. So let's walk through it step by step. 1. If violence is harmful, defined as damaging bodies, destabilizing communities, and threatening life, it is physical, material, objective harm, or is violence all the previous plus anything that reinforces oppression, trauma, or inequity? Harm is emotional, symbolic, subjective, and structural. 2. It is only justifiable when preventing a greater harm, defined as you may cause harm only to prevent a greater physical harm, or greater harm includes emotional injury, symbolic violence, and systemic injustice. And then 3, the greatest harm is the loss of life. The harm that cannot be undone, the harm that overrides all others, or the loss of life is one harm among many forms of violence. Structural harm, emotional harm, and symbolic harm can be treated as morally equivalent. And then 4, then when is the moral use of physical force allowed? This is the moment where we must confront the logic of our own answers. If violence is harmful and only preventing greater harm can justify it, well, your definition of harm determines your answer and definition of justification. This is the moment where everything you've reasoned all comes together. You've defined violence, you've examined its purposes, you've confronted the moral paradox, you've ranked the harms, you've identified the threshold, and now your principle reveals itself. 1, violence is only moral when it preserves life. This is the core of just war theory, self-defense doctrine, and moral philosophy. Violence is justified only when it prevents the greatest harm the loss of life, or violence may be justified for broader reasons, to resist oppression, to disrupt systems, to protect identity, to reclaim power. So which framework produces a coherent moral rule? The one that ties violence to life, or the one that ties violence to subjective or systemic harms? 2, it is not for dominance. Using violence to assert dominance is tyranny. The very moral philosophy sought to restrain. Or dominance can be reframed as reclaiming space or redistributing power. The same act is labeled as liberation or oppression depending on who performs it. So is dominance ever a moral justification for force, or is it simply power by another name? It is not for revenge. Revenge is morally corrupting. It is sent into cycles of harm. Or revenge is reframed as restorative justice, speaking truth to power or holding oppressors accountable. So is revenge immoral, or does renaming it make it moral? Force is not for punishment. Punishment belongs to institutions, courts, laws, due process. Individuals using violence to punish is vigilantism, or punishment is framed as accountability when carried out through force or coercion. So is punishment a moral justification for violence, or simply retaliation with moral vocabulary? So here's where I fall and why. Only to protect life. This is the principle that survives every test. It's the only justification that avoids arbitrariness, avoids subjectivity, avoids political bias, avoids the cycles of escalation, avoids redefining violence to suit my ideology. If violence is always harmful and only preventing the greater harm can justify it, and the greatest harm is the destruction of life, then violence is only moral when it preserves life, not when it asserts dominance, not when it expresses rage, not when it punishes, not when it advances a political cause, only when it protects life. And now that we've reached the principle that violence is only moral when it preserves life, I want to end with something personal. Because I'm not speaking about violence as an abstract. I've seen war. I've participated in violent actions. Over 20 years of my life has been spent in that sphere. And I can tell you something that most people who advocate so casually for violence simply don't understand. You have no idea what you're asking for. Violence is not cinematic. It is not cleansing. It is not the righteous fire of God. It is chaos. It is fear. It is irreversible loss. It takes pieces of you that you will not get back. In short, the Hollywood depiction and the romanticizing of conflict is bullshit. So when we talk about the responsibilities that flow from this principle, I'm not talking theoretically. I'm talking from the weight of memory, loss, consequence, and the regrets that come with such a life. So what does that mean for us as a people? What do we own as individuals and as society to avoid tragedy? Well, we have 4 responsibilities. Number 1, citizens have a responsibility to restrain themselves, not because they are weak, but because they understand what happens when restraint collapses. Most people who call for violence have never seen what a body looks like after a blast. They've never heard the sound a family member makes when they learn someone is never coming home. If violence is only moral to preserve life, then citizens must treat violence as the last line of defense, not the first tool of frustration. Number 2, leaders have responsibility to de-escalate because their words can ignite people who have never seen the consequences of what they're being encouraged to do. A leader who casually invokes violence is playing with forces they do not control. Once the switch is on, it is on. If violence is only moral to preserve life, then leaders must speak with the gravity of people who understand violence's cost. Number 3, institutions exist to give people alternatives to violence. Courts, elections, procedures, due process. When institutions fail or are corrupted, people reach for force. When institutions are delegitimized, people reach for force faster. If violence is only moral to preserve life, then institutions must be strong enough, fair enough, and trusted enough to keep people from believing violence is their only option. 4, the norms matter. And they are the ones that restrain us. Respect for life, respect for process, respect for the humanity of people we vehemently disagree with. Because once violence begins, it does not stay contained. It spreads, it escalates, it takes on a life of its own. I don't say this as a philosopher. I say to someone who's watched it happen time and again. Once the shooting starts, it doesn't stop until one side is near annihilation. And 5, what does someone who has seen real violence know that others don't and is obligated to say? I can't speak for others, but I know this. Violence is not a tool you pick up and put down. It is not a dial you can turn up or down. It is a switch. It marks you. It follows you. It changes you in ways you don't get to choose. So when someone with no experience of violence calls for it, casually, confidently, even eagerly, I feel sadness I cannot fully express. Because they are asking for something they do not understand. And by the time they do understand, it will be too late. If violence is only moral to preserve life, then the greatest responsibility we have is to keep people from learning that lesson the hard way. Please leave a comment, like, and subscribe. May your curiosity last and the desire to seek truth grow. May peace and conversation win in the end. Socratic Vet, out.